The God you pray to has a name, not God in general, not a higher power or some vague sense of something larger than yourself. A specific name, Yahweh. And before 621 BC, that name was one of several names Israelites used when they prayed. One of several divine presences they honored. One entry in a living pantheon they had inherited from their ancestors and were passing to their children. I am going to show you the evidence for that. I am going to show you the inscriptions, the figurines, the altars, and the temple catalogue. I am going to show you what was officially present in the Jerusalem temple, not in some remote backcountry, not in some distant foreign territory, but in the house of God itself, the most sacred structure in the Israelite world. And then I am going to show you how it was erased, not forgotten, not gradually abandoned over centuries, erased by a king in a single campaign, using a book that his own government almost certainly wrote and then staged a discovery of. And when I am done with all of that, I am going to read you the most famous prayer in the history of Judaism, a prayer that billions of people have said as a declaration of eternal divine truth. And I am going to tell you where it came from, because it did not come from where you were told it came from. Stay with me on this. I know these are large claims. I would not make them if the evidence were not there. The evidence is there. It has been sitting in libraries and museum archives and in the ground of the Sinai desert, available to any person willing to look at it. You just have to be willing to read it as history before you decide what it means for your faith. In 1975 and 1976, an Israeli archaeologist named Ze'ev Meshel excavated a remote desert site in the Sinai called Kuntilet Ajrud. It sat along an ancient caravan route in one of the emptiest stretches of the Negev, roughly 40 miles south of Kadesh Barnea. The site had once been a way station for traders and travelers. By the 9th century BC, it had been abandoned. By 1975, it had been empty for nearly 3,000 years. What Meshel found there were two large ceramic storage jars, both painted with inscriptions in red ink, both written in ancient Hebrew, both dated by carbon-14 analysis to between 801 and 770 BC. The inscriptions read, "I have blessed you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah." And on the second jar, "I have blessed you by Yahweh of Teman and by his Asherah." If you do not read ancient Hebrew, that might not immediately land. Here is why it should. In Hebrew grammar, a divine name cannot take a possessive suffix. The rules of the language prohibit it. You cannot say his God in the grammatical possessive when directly naming God. Proper names don't work that way. Which means his Asherah is not a reference to something Yahweh owns. It is a reference to someone, to a consort, to a female divine presence paired with Yahweh as a partner. Asherah was not a minor local deity. She was the mother goddess of the Canaanite world, associated with fertility, the sea, sacred trees. And here, at an Israelite way station in the Sinai desert, travelers were writing greetings that invoked her alongside Yahweh. As a pair, as naturally as you might say God bless you while meaning two specific divine beings, not one. The carbon dating matters. These inscriptions are from within living memory of the prophet Elijah, the era of the divided monarchy. Israel was a functioning, literate state, and in that state, Yahweh had a wife. The figurines confirm it. Roughly 1,000 small clay female figurines, scholars call them Judean pillar figurines, have been recovered from archaeological contexts across ancient Judah, dated from the 9th century BC through the Babylonian destruction in 586 BC. They are found in domestic spaces, in houses, in courtyards, in the rooms where ordinary families kept what mattered to them. They depict a woman with her hands supporting her breasts, the posture of a goddess offering nourishment. Almost certainly Asherah, present in Judahite homes for 300 years. Think about what 3 centuries of consistent evidence means. Multiple generations of ordinary families keeping a goddess figure in their homes. Mothers showing daughters, fathers keeping the figure on the shelf where the household gods lived. Children growing up with a goddess in the house. That is not occasional syncretism, that was their religion. The archaeologist William Dever, who has spent his career excavating ancient Israelite sites, wrote in Did God Have a Wife? That the real religion of ancient Israel was almost everything the biblical writers condemned. He was not being polemical. He was describing what the archaeology showed. The gods by name: Asherah, Baal the storm god, Ashtoreth the great goddess of love and war, Chemosh god of Moab, Milcom god of Ammon, the host of heaven, the sun, the moon, the planets, each with its ritual and its altar and its dedicated priests. Not metaphors, not folk superstitions practiced only in ignorance, named divine beings with specific practices present in the official religious life of Israel and Judah for centuries. Now I need you to hear something carefully, because this next part is about a specific location, and the location is the point. What I just described was not only happening in the homes of ordinary people, it was not only happening at rural hilltop sanctuaries in the backcountry, it was happening in the Temple of Jerusalem. The Temple, the national religious institution of the Israelite kingdom, the house of Yahweh himself. This is not inference, it is a list. 2 Kings chapter 23 is effectively an inventory of what Josiah found in and around the Jerusalem temple immediately before his reform. The text frames it as righteous destruction. Look what the king removed. But read it as inventory, and you get something the text does not fully intend to show. Vessels made for Baal, made for Asherah, made for the host of heaven, not smuggled in by foreign workers, not secretly installed by enemies, made by temple artisans in Jerusalem for ritual worship in the temple. An Asherah pole, not outside the compound, not in a side chapel at the edge of the complex, in the temple itself. Josiah had it removed and burned in the Kidron Valley. He ground the remains to dust and scattered it on the graves of ordinary people. You do not burn an Asherah pole and grind it to dust unless it is substantial, unless it is real and large and installed. It was in the official temple of Israel. Rooms built into the temple compound. The text says houses, plural, permanent structures within the temple's architecture, where women wove hangings for the Asherah. A craft industry embedded in the temple itself. The infrastructure required organization. The hangings required regular production. This was not occasional. And then there are the horses. At the entrance to the temple, at the gate where every single worshiper passed on their way to pray, King Josiah found horses dedicated to the sun, living animals tended by temple personnel. The text also mentions chariots of the sun. Josiah burned them. Think about that for a second. Horses dedicated to the sun, kept at the gate of the house of Yahweh, not hidden in a back chamber, at the entrance, in plain sight of every pilgrim who came for a festival, every family who brought their children to see the most sacred place in their world. Those children grew up knowing the horses were there. It was part of what the temple was. Altars on the roof. The kings of Judah had constructed altars on the upper chambers, dedicated to the host of heaven, oriented toward the open sky. Celestial worship from the rooftop of the national temple, looking directly at the divine objects being venerated. They didn't sneak the goddess in. They built her a room. This was the official religion of Jerusalem for a very long time. In 621 BC, in the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah ordered the repair of the temple, routine maintenance on an ancient building. During the renovation, the high priest Hilkiah came to the royal secretary with a document. He said he had found it during the renovation in the temple. He called it the Book of the Law. The secretary read the book to Josiah. Josiah tore his robes. He sent messengers to a prophetess named Huldah to verify it. She confirmed it was authentic. Josiah gathered the people of Jerusalem, read the book to the assembly, and made a covenant with Yahweh. Then he began the destruction. The reform of Judah was built on a single document, found during a renovation commissioned by the king, by the high priest who served the king. At the moment the king was implementing the reform the document mandated. Israel Finkelstein, professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University, one of the most respected biblical archaeologists working today, argued with his colleague Neil Asher Silberman in The Bible Unearthed that the Book of the Law Hilkiah found was not found. It was composed by the court of Josiah to provide legal and theological basis for the program Josiah was already executing. This argument is not speculation. It is built on what the book does. The Book of the Law, found in 621 BC, is by broad scholarly consensus the book we call Deuteronomy, or the core of it. And Deuteronomy does several very specific things that were extraordinarily convenient for Josiah's political agenda. It centralizes worship. All legitimate worship of Yahweh must take place at a single central sanctuary, not at local hilltop altars, the rural high places called Bamot that had operated throughout the Judahite countryside for generations, only at the central sanctuary, the one in Jerusalem, the one controlled by Josiah's priestly establishment. The rural Bamot were not merely theologically secondary under this law, they were illegal. And this had immediate economic and political consequences. The rural sanctuaries collected tithes and offerings. They employed their own priests. They were the local religious infrastructure of every community in Judah that was not Jerusalem, functioning semi-autonomously for generations. Centralizing worship at Jerusalem meant centralizing the flow of offerings. It meant eliminating the local institutions that operated outside Josiah's direct control. The book also declared the destruction of every other god to be a covenantal obligation. The Asherah, the Baal vessels, the sun horses, the roof altars, under Deuteronomy, these were not practices of ambiguous standing. They were covenant violations, betrayals of an agreement Yahweh had supposedly made with Israel through Moses centuries before. An agreement that had always required exclusive loyalty. An agreement, the book said, had always been the law. The timing cannot be explained away. The book appeared when a centralizing king was beginning a program of reform. It was found during a renovation he had commissioned by the high priest who served him. It confirmed every element of the reform he was implementing. It declared every institution he needed to destroy to be a violation of a covenant that had supposedly been in force for 5 centuries. And nobody had cited it before. In all the preceding centuries of Israelite history, in the records of all the kings before Josiah, in the writings of the prophets, in every surviving reference to religious law from any earlier period, the book of the law that appeared in 621 BC is absent. No text before that date quotes its specific provisions. The prophets who preceded Josiah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, Isaiah, never cite the law this book contains, even when condemning exactly the practices it condemns. It appeared when it was needed. The destruction that followed was not reform. It was erasure. Josiah went through Judah from Geba in the north to Beersheba in the south. He removed every local high place. He killed the priests who served them. He defiled their altars by burning human bones on them to render them permanently unclean. He demolished the sanctuaries outside Jerusalem that Solomon himself had built centuries before, for Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the god of Moab, and for Milcom, the god of Ammon. These structures had been standing for roughly 350 years. Kings regarded as relatively faithful to Yahweh had allowed them to stand. Josiah tore them down. He went north to Bethel, the ancient religious center of the old northern kingdom, and burned the high place there. He defiled the altar. Then he opened the graves in the surrounding area and burned the bones of the dead on the altar, not as a memorial, to defile, to make that ground permanently, ritually unclean. He was reaching into the earth to drag the dead into his program. The scale, from Geba to Beersheba, north to Bethel, every community in Judah, every local religious site, every priest who served a god other than Yahweh in the way the new book required. 350 years of sanctuaries that had operated with official sanction, serving multiple divine beings, embedded in the daily life of ordinary people, destroyed in one campaign. The people who had kept Asherah figurines in their homes, who had prayed at the local high places their grandparents built, who had seen the horses at the temple gate their whole lives, they did not get a theological conversation. Their priests were killed. Their gods were declared to have never been real. And then a book was read to them saying this had always been the law. In 1670 in Amsterdam, a philosopher named Baruch Spinoza published a book without his name on it. False publisher on the title page. City of publication not identified. He had grown up watching what happened to people who said in print what he was about to say. In the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, in chapters 7 through 10, Spinoza read the book of Deuteronomy the way you would read any other ancient document. Not as divine revelation, as a human text subject to the same questions any ancient writing requires. Who wrote this, when, and why? His observations were textual and specific. Deuteronomy refers to Moses in the third person throughout. Moses is he, not I. A man writing his own account of events he participated in does not refer to himself in the third person for hundreds of pages. Deuteronomy describes the death of Moses, the detail of where he was buried, what he could see from the mountain where he stood before he died. A man cannot describe his own burial. He was not there for it. Deuteronomy uses geographical place names, names of cities and territories that did not exist during the lifetime of Moses, names that only came into use after Moses was dead. A man cannot use a name for a place that had not yet been given. Spinoza's conclusion: Deuteronomy was not written by Moses. It was composed centuries after the events it describes. The text itself shows this if you read it as a document, rather than deciding in advance that it must have been written by the person it names as its author. He said this 270 years before Ze'ev Meshel found the Kuntilit Adrud inscriptions, 331 years before Finkelstein and Silberman published their archaeological analysis. Without the figurines, without the archaeological record of what was in the temple, he said it by reading the book carefully, following the evidence, and refusing to let tradition tell him what the documents meant before he had read them for himself. And then he drew the implication that made him the most dangerous writer in 17th century Europe. If the Book of the Law found in 621 BC was not an ancient document recovered during a renovation, but a text composed by Josiah's government, then the foundational claim embedded in that book, the claim that Yahweh had always demanded exclusive worship and that the covenant requiring monotheism had been established centuries before Josiah, was not a transcription of divine law reaching back to the desert of Sinai. It was a political document, written to assert what its authors needed to be true. The claim that God chose Israel is a claim made in a book written by Israel to assert that God chose them. Spinoza was not making a theological argument. He was not attacking the existence of God or the sincerity of faith. He was identifying the human mechanism by which a religious claim acquires the appearance of divine origin. You compose the text. You stage the discovery. A generation later, people believe it was always there. A century later, they cannot imagine it was not. 2 millennia later, it is the foundation of Western monotheism. He was excommunicated from the Amsterdam Jewish community in 1656, at 23 years old. The most severe herem in the documented history of that community. The text does not name what he had done. It says his abominable heresies and his monstrous deeds without specifying them, as if naming them would give the ideas currency. He continued writing. He never recanted. He spent the remaining 20 years of his life working through the implications of what careful reading showed. There is an evening I think about when I get to this part of the history. I had been retired from Farragut High School for about 4 years. I was well past the stage of discovery and into the stage of what you do with it, which is harder. Discovery has some excitement in it. The aftermath is mostly wait. An old colleague had organized a dinner for 8 or 9 of us who had taught there at overlapping times. One of those West Side Knoxville restaurants with the red and white tablecloths that nobody plans to go back to, but somehow always does. Midway through the evening, a man I had known for over 20 years, a Sunday school teacher himself, a genuinely decent man, brought up a Bible study series his church was doing. An Old Testament survey. I made the mistake I still sometimes make, the mistake of assuming that people who study the Bible seriously want to know what serious study of the Bible actually shows. I said something like, "What's interesting is that before 621 BC, the temple in Jerusalem wasn't monotheistic. There was an Asherah pole inside the temple itself, an official goddess symbol in the house of Yahweh." The high priest found a book during renovations that most scholars now believe was composed by the king's own government to provide a mandate for eliminating the other gods. The table did not erupt. That would have been simpler. It went quiet in the particular way a gathering goes quiet when someone has said something everyone would prefer not to have been said. 2 conversations shifted to the dessert menu. The man I had been speaking to nodded slowly, with the expression of someone waiting for a weather event to pass. Then, a few minutes later, His wife leaned forward with genuine kindness in her face and said, "Well, the Lord says, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.'" The Shema. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. As if 4 words from a prayer answered a historical question, as if the existence of the declaration refuted the evidence about where the declaration came from. I did not argue. I said something like, "Yes, that's a beautiful verse," and let the conversation move on. I drove home in silence. I sat on the back porch with the porch light on, and the trees dark beyond the yard. Not angry. I was past angry by then. Carrying the particular weight of knowing something you cannot unknow, in a room full of people who have decided not to want to know it with you. The porch light was on. The summer was thick. The trees were still. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." In Hebrew, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. The Shema. The declaration at the center of Jewish prayer for more than 2,000 years. The words every observant Jew is commanded to say twice daily. The words said at the moment of death in the Yom Kippur service, worn in the mezuzah on the doorpost. The foundation of Christian monotheism. The words carved in church stonework on 6 continents across 20 centuries of Western civilization. This verse comes from the book of Deuteronomy, the book that was found in the Temple of Jerusalem in 621 BC by the high priest who served the king who was eliminating polytheism from Judah. The book that leading scholars of biblical archaeology, following the analysis Spinoza made in 1670, now broadly understand to have been composed by the Josianic government as a program document for the reform. The book written to mandate the destruction of Asherah, Baal, Ashtoreth, Chemosh, Milcom, and the host of heaven. Written to declare that these gods, who'd been worshipped in the Jerusalem temple for centuries, whose goddess's pole had stood inside the house of Yahweh, whose horses had been kept openly at the temple gate, had always been abominations against a covenant the people had never been clearly informed of until the high priest found the document that contained it. The most ancient feeling prayer in the Western world has a specific birth date, 621 BC. It was composed as part of a reform program by a government that needed it to sound eternal. It was placed in a book found at the precise moment the reform required divine mandate. And that book was then used to destroy the gods that Israelites had been worshipping in their official national temple for generations. Now, Sim, this is where I want to be precise, because Spinoza was precise here, and it matters. That is not proof that God does not exist. I am not making that argument. History cannot get you to that question. Philosophy struggles with it. Spinoza himself was not making that argument. What he was doing was something more specific, identifying the human mechanism by which a religious claim acquires the weight of eternal truth. When an institution tells you that your God has always been the only God, that the monotheism you inherited is an eternal divine truth, not a human construction, what you are hearing is the claim of an institution built on a political document composed in the 7th century BC by a government that needed that claim to be true. The prayer you say every morning as an affirmation of eternal divine reality was written to serve the political consolidation of a Judahite king. The gods it declares to be non-existent were worshipped in the national temple for generations before that king was born. Their ritual objects built into the temple's permanent architecture. Their horses kept openly at the gate. The Shema is beautiful. I still think it is beautiful. There is something in the simplicity of those 4 words that carries a weight no historical argument can fully dissolve. I am not trying to dissolve it. But the weight those words carry, once you know where they came from, is different from the weight they carried before you knew. Spinoza knew. He figured it out in a small house in Amsterdam by reading the text carefully and refusing to let tradition tell him what it meant in advance. He was cast out of his community at 23 for it. He continued writing. He spent the rest of his life working through the implications, grinding lenses for a living, declining every academic appointment that would have required him to soften what he had found. He did not have the archaeology. He had the text. He read it the way you read any human text, and the text showed him what 3 centuries of archaeological excavation later confirmed. The God you pray to has a name. Before 621 BC, that name was one of several. The decision to make it the only name was made by human beings in a specific year, for specific political reasons, using a book they almost certainly wrote and then staged a discovery of. That's the truth of it. Make of that what you will.